Hello, music makers. Welcome back. Let's finish some trance music, shall we? Quite a few of you have asked, how do you know when a track is finished? And even though I finish more tracks than most, unfortunately, my answers are things beginners don't want to hear. Like, tracks are never really finished. Or the wonderfully ironic, you'll get a better feel for whether a track is finished by finishing more tracks. Instead, it's probably best I just show you. Let's go. So this track comes about from last week's live stream. Yes, if you didn't know, I do stream live every month on the last Sunday of the month at 6 p.m. GMT. Last week I was answering a layering question, and to show an example, I used the quick trance template I'd put together for last month's ARP video. And someone suggested, how about finishing a track with those sounds? Great idea. However, the circumstances were not ideal. By this point, we were 2 to 3 hours into the live stream, and I was intending on wrapping up in the next hour or so. Also, I'm terrible at multitasking, and I was trying to make the track whilst answering questions from chat. In the end, about 3 hours later, we did get a full track together, a full left-to-right arrangement, the one you're hearing in the background now. However, upon listening to it with fresh ears, as you might imagine from me being a little rushed and or distracted, there's a few things that need tidying up. In fact, here are the first notes I made. But I stopped myself from changing anything. I have resisted the urge to tweak, and instead, like a proper YouTuber, I'm going to make a video about it. So I'm hitting record, and I'm going to talk you through my thoughts as I finish off this track. Okay, so here is the track in question. Standard mix-in and mix-out sections, mostly drums and bass, except also waves and seagulls, because chat determined that the reason my Wicked game cover was so successful must have been because of the waves and seagulls. So we're trying to recreate that magic here. So a lot of the problems with this track stem from the approach to making it in the first place. It's a great list of what not to do. Not only was I distracted and short on time, I was also working entirely on headphones, I didn't use any references, and I hadn't set my master fader to 0. So basically the opposite of what I've been telling you to do in my videos. Not an ideal start. Okay, so I've lined up some references, lining up their last drop with my last drop, so I could quickly A-B. And the first thing I noticed when I compare them is the references are a lot brighter and a lot fizzier. You can see the names here. I picked recent releases that have big melodies, like mine. I'm not surprised the tonal difference is there, because as I say, I wasn't referencing when I made the track. Well, the original sounds were loosely based on the Adagio for Strings, William Orbit mix. But anyway, let me show you an A-B versus the modern stuff. If this section is demonetized, I'll have to jump ahead. But let's try. Here's my track. So, as you can hear, total energy levels are actually quite similar, but you can hear the tonal difference. They are a lot brighter and busier. Now, I'm not too worried because I don't want to fully copy that kind of tone for several reasons. Firstly, in my experience, mixes that bright and busy don't actually work well in a club. Secondly, this track of mine is supposed to evoke some 90s nostalgia, so I purposely don't want to go all the way to the new sound. Thirdly, the references I happened to gather all had much longer notes in their melody, whereas mine is a fast ARP. So even if I wanted to copy them 100%, I couldn't. We just don't have the space. In fact, it's not just my melody. I have a gated pad and bass rhythms which all sync up. So my track is a little more groove focused. A lot of our energy is coming from the fast-moving rhythm. We don't need to fill space with compression and reverbs, etc. The first thing I wanted to look at was the transition into the first break. I've kept a before and after of everything, by the way. Let me show you how it was. So for me, that's a little too sudden. It just comes out of nowhere. There's no preparation for any change. A few reasons being the drums just stop, and also the bass. There's a musical problem. The turnaround is on note 7 and 1, but the break starts on note 6. So because the chords in this track start just before the bar, here you're led to believe we're going back to chord 1, and then suddenly chord 6 comes in the break. Not good. I tackled the easiest things first. I put some transition symbols in. I found these two from the Kashmir pack. And just as that is swelling in, the kick drum stops, and the sub does too. So we are being prepared for some kind of change. I've changed that final bass note to move down to note 6. And also there was a delay already on the bass. So I've increased the send on that, so it's going to echo off instead of suddenly stopping, increasing both the send and the repeats. I'm also gradually removing the low frequencies, so we won't miss the bass when it leaves, and what is left will echo off instead of suddenly stopping. And that's all it took to sort out the first and most of the other transitions. Okay, so the main problem was the first two drops. Well, they weren't dropping. The build-ups seemed fine, but the payoff just wasn't quite there. Not terrible, just something lacking. And it wasn't anything obvious. I couldn't put my finger on it. As you can see from my notes, I had lots of theories, and in the end, it turned out I was kind of right. It turned out to be lots of little things. So let me play you back the first build and drop. So, not quite working for me, that. When a drop doesn't work, it's usually down to the same thing. Something that was hinted at in the build-up is then not delivered. It could be something as simple as the overall energy level or volume does not match what you expect. It could be a tonal thing, frequencies disappearing, or it could be a rhythmic thing. Something fast then became slow. There's all kinds of reasons, and as it turns out, this one had a little bit of everything. Let me show you what I did. First of all, I decided to roll the top percussion through the first break. This is for a couple of reasons. First of all, it doesn't make sense to have a full stop here right at the beginning. The DJ will have just mixed this in, and you don't want people to stop dancing too often. Our main break is for that. This introduction break can still be lower in energy while we introduce our main hook, but we can still keep the momentum and rhythm flowing. So we keep the top percussion running. There's no kick though. The bass is also out. I'm also introducing the lead earlier than the old version. You could hear it under the filter sooner. And then what that lets me do is fade out the top percussion here, which lets us build more anticipation for the drop. And while we're here, I can show you this. One other thing I did was slightly increase the level of the top percussion. That decision came after adjusting the lead. I'll show you that later, but that's one more reason the drop is helped. One other problem was the pad. That is running all the way right to the end here. This one. You can hear it's also building by opening the filter. But this isn't in the drop. It sounds like it's about to go round again because the chord has arrived slightly before the bar. Now, whatever replaces that pad energy has to have at least that amount or more. and I swapped to a gated one. So technically it has more energy in the sense that it's now rhythmic when the other one was static, but overall in terms of total amount of sound, we've actually lost something because there's now gaps in the sound. Obviously, I could just put the pad in the first drop, but I was saving that for the second drop. I wanted this first drop to be lower energy, obviously, and I wanted the rhythm to be the focus because the main lead is rhythmic. So what I've done is similar to what we did with the bass transition. I'm filtering out the lows until it's basically nothing. Again, this builds anticipation because something's going away, and then we don't have to replace it. Certainly not one-to-one, anyway. Listen out for that top percussion, fading too. You can see the automation there for the high-pass filter. So removing most of that low-mid energy, which a pad is dominant in. It works better, but I still wasn't fully satisfied. So I have adjusted the mix on the gated pad. So when we drop, there's a little bit of the sustained sound still in there. Here's how it sounded before. So just letting a little bit of that constant energy through. Now, the lead sound, this is where the big breakthrough was. I realized there was a mistake in the filter automation. We can see it here on the original drop. Enhance. Here is the culprit. Oh dear, oh dear. We were opening the filter, teasing all these lovely high frequencies, which then didn't arrive in the drop. If we look at the last drop, which I didn't have a problem with, you can see all the frequencies we had hinted at were delivered. Unlike here. So that was a huge part of it. Let's compare. So hopefully you can hear. Huge difference in energy there. After discovering that, I thought that might fix everything. But as always with music, it's like a yin and yang. It's like chasing your tail, or the butterfly effect. One change results in other things too. After fixing the filter on the lead, it became apparent that the top percussion no longer had the energy to match that. Because, of course, those drums were initially balanced around the old lead sound. So as I said earlier, I raised the total level of the top percussion, but that still wasn't quite enough. So I ended up adding another top loop. I thought a busy hi-hat would help connect the rhythmic lead with the drums. I chose this. That did just the job. It connected the lead sound to the percussion by adding the same kind of pace and filling in just the right frequencies. However, this then had its own knock-on effect. The backbeat suddenly sounded weak. The clap. Tonally, I thought the claps we had were fine, but they were completely dry, so I emphasized the backbeat by lengthening the claps with reverb. Let's listen to that in the context of the full track. See if you can hear what I was hearing. Without. Subtle, but hopefully you can hear how that links the claps up, helps them sit better with the surrounding elements. So let's listen to the before and after of the top percussion now. Now that's out of context, but you can hear the energy level difference, the amount I had to raise it by. So lots of little things adding up, but that wasn't everything. I noticed the gate I was using for rhythm, which was on the pad and the bass, was ever so slightly swung. And one of the initial notes I took was that the bass sounded messy. I noticed it in the intro and outro where the bass was exposed. Well, swing on the gate is a problem because my original bass was doing two things. There's a detuned layer, unison voices acting like the old JP800. Again, I was loosely emulating the William Orbit Adagio for strings. And to back that up, I had this separate oscillator doing a solid saw type bass, going through its own filter. The problem was I was using the audio gate for rhythm, not note triggers. So in order to get this filter to move, I had to make this pattern with the LFO. As you can see, all the rhythm is coming from that audio effect gate. These are just long notes underneath. So one of the reasons the bass sounded messy was the LFO pattern that I had made to trigger the filter was not aligning with the slightly swung audio gate. The main ARP lead isn't swung at all, so lots of things weren't lining up. So I straightened the gates on the bass and the pad. I then decided the solid saw element of that bass wasn't really giving me what I wanted. Nothing I drew in that LFO section really gave me the sound I wanted anyway. Best separate the sound so I have full control over the envelope. And the separate saw. That mostly tidied up what I was hearing in the bass, rhythmically at least. But again, there was a knock-on effect. Now the bass had lost some thickness. The reason being, both of those two bass sounds when they were in the same synth were adding together pre-distortion. They were going through this soft clipper in the effects section here. Now I can't compensate by just turning up the clipping effect. The two sounds used to combine before the distortion. So I had to recreate that somewhat. Here's what I ended up with. Pushing this mid-bump into a saturator. The Bedroom Producers blog saturator, a little bit of the tape there. And while I'm here, one of the things that annoyed me in the original sound was the side channel was a little muddy. That can happen when you're using detuned basses. So I've tidied that up with the Safe Bass feature here on the Alex Hilton stereo control. So let's do a comparison. Hopefully you can hear the new bass is both tidier and in that supports the rhythm rather than conflicts with it. Hopefully you can hear that one's just a little bit sloppier. Speaking of tidying up bass, I also changed the sub. The sub was also using the gate for rhythm. Again, slightly swung by accident. Those on good headphones and speakers should be able to hear this. Now, a subtrack on a rhythm that busy can sound like a lot of extra kick drums almost. Down there at the sub level, if you have this kind of this kind of machine gun rhythm with short 16th notes, it could be very distracting when your main pulse is supposed to come from the 4 on the floor kick drum. So I decided to turn off the rhythm and just let the bass do the long notes and instead adjust the side chain. So the kick drum has a little bit more room to breathe. This is where it used to be. It was feeling like one long drone without that gate rhythm, so I've left some room for the kick to finish. And this being full right till the end wasn't helping that matter either. So I've shaped this downwards, giving the sub a tail, almost like acting as a kick extension now. Again, not distracting from the kick, which should be the dominant factor. Now let's compare. This will definitely test your system if you can hear the difference between these two. If that was too hard to hear, let's just solo bass and drums. See if you can hear the difference now. So a bit drony, and the new one. Hopefully you can hear that's a little tidier, or at least a little more danceable. Now, that's still not everything. Remember earlier how I was talking about the references sounding a lot brighter? If I could move a little bit towards that sound, that would surely secure the drop. Now, I'm sure most of you are thinking that's just a difference in mastering. but I can hear that all that is needed is to brighten the lead sound. So, after trying a few things like EQs, I ended up settling on an OTT kind of concept. I didn't just want to raise the high frequencies, I wanted to condense them too. Shock and horror, I know, Bthelick using compression. Anyway, OTT itself was getting me close, but I needed a little more control. So I reached for 6 samples Cram It, which is exactly that. It's OTT with a bit more control. It has control over the crossover frequencies, whether it uses upwards, downwards compression. It also has some pre and post distortion phases to help control levels, and it has oversampling too. So this is mixed in a little bit, automated, just before the drop. Again, another slight change on the drop, not the build, to help differentiate that energy. Let's compare. Now, I've placed this post ambient effects, post delay and reverb, so that the upward compression portion of the process will suck up any of the low-level ambience and bring it to the forefront, giving us more energy. Normally, this would ruin what little dynamic range we have in our lead, which is important because this is a rhythmic lead. But that's why we mix it in a little bit, so we don't ruin the punch. Speaking of ambient effects, I did end up changing the reverb type. Originally, I had used Tal Reverb 4. It's a nice sounding and pretty flexible reverb you can use on lots of sources. See, nothing wrong with that, but this is why we reference, because only when I was referencing did I decide we were lacking some energy in the ambience too. So I tried a few others, and I ended up really liking the top end, the glassiness of Charm Verb by Melda. That's this one. Normally reverbs which carry the top end like this get in the way of the original signal, but this one doesn't. It's very clean. Hear that top sparkle? That got me closer to the references, but then I missed the mid-energy from the Tal reverb, so I almost added that back. But when I was trying other reverbs, it turned out Supermassive by Valhalla was even better. That sounds like this. That almost just sounds like I was extending the synth notes. So I ended up running both of those in parallel. Or as normal people will understand it, sending to both reverbs at the same time. So now with the reverbs and the Cram It, let's compare. Now, last but not least, speaking of preserving the rhythm of that arpeggiated lead, I realized the rhythm could be more consistent. I thought it missed a note here. I thought it was already there, but I must have been hearing the delay effect fill in that gap. As you can see on the second bar, that rhythm is there. I think I always intended to have it there. This collection of 3 syncopated notes at the end of the bar was clearly my intention anyway. That's what I programmed on all the audio gate effect rhythms. So I changed the lead to have that in every bar. So let's compare all the changes. Here is before. And after. There we go. Huge difference. Okay, little bits for the rest of the track. I applied what I learned to the other transitions and drops. And now for the main break. The main thing I wanted to change in the break was the strings. We have these nice cellos come in, but right now they're just the same part as the pad, exactly the same chords and voicing. So I've added some interest with a little melody on some violins. It was a little much introducing them straight away, so I've let the cellos come in first still. Then the violin melody. Then the piano joins as before. Lead starts to filter in.
And we are all connected, like tides around the world.
I've made the voice a little clearer by turning it up and adding some overdrive to the middle frequencies, and de-essing it too.
In all of life there is a rhythm. All things living carry out this tune.
And for last drop hype, on the lead I add an extra octave via one more oscillator. Finish off that new string melody, I thought I would add it to the very end. Possibly too much, but by this point, does it matter? It's still not as messy as some of the references, so I'm fine with that. Now, the final question. The melody. I never really wrote one. This is just the first iteration arpeggio I came up with based on the chord movement, just using notes 1 and 3 of the chord. Sounds great, especially now the drop works. But as I mentioned before, the original inspiration was Adagio for Strings, William Orbit's edit. And while that is also an arpeggio, it has a moving melody within it. And I wanted to attempt something like that. So I've had a play. It's not very Adagio for Strings at all, because we don't have that length of chord structure. But it is more melodic, and I'd like to know what you think.
All things living carry out this tune.
I've got a bit of demoitis here because I can't tell if that's better or worse. Is it too much? Or is it good? Back to the original. Alternative. It's not that much of a departure. As you can see, it's the same rhythm. I just started moving the notes through the scale. 1, 2, 3, 2, 7, 1 is the main hook, with some variations in question and answer format. It's definitely a lift in energy. Or maybe it's something that only happens in the last drop. Let me know in the comments what you think. Would you prefer that melody for the whole thing? Or just the last drop? Or should I keep that original pure arpeggio? Right then. Speaking of the comments, I'll be taking name suggestions for this track as well, not just what you think I should do with the melody. Let me know what you think this track should be called down below. And in the meantime, I hope you learned something. If you did, you know what to do. Press some buttons for me, or if you're feeling extra generous, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description. And until next week, I will see you in the comments. Bye-bye.